Who? Jin Jianwu let out a sigh without realizing it. He was currently in the house of an old physician. The doctor was already dead in his own house. Flies were swarming around his body, and his blood, which had spilled on the ground, was already hardened. The doctor's condition meant that he had been dead for quite some time. Because Hukum had received and suffered a lot of damage, Jin Jianwu thought that Hukum would be hiding in one of the physician's houses in Chengdu. This was also the reason why the Hao clan members were mobilized to search each of the physician's houses. But no trace of Hukum had been found anywhere. It turns out Hukum had chosen this place because the physician in front of him had long retired from the front lines. This would mean that the retired doctor wouldn't be included in the list of the Hao clan's information network, hence the Hao clan members failed to search this place. How did he find this? Hukum must have killed the old doctor after treating his own wounds here. Without knowing that, he and the Hao clan members were looking in the wrong place. He trembled at the ingenuity of Hukum. But it was Piuwul who surprised him even more. Since Piuwul managed to find the place that the Hao clan failed to find. Even if Jin Jianwu constantly watched Piuwul from the sidelines, he still couldn't figure out how Piuwul did it. He only observed Piuwul looking around a few times. So he felt like Piuwul was just lucky enough to find this place. However, Jin Jianwu denied his thoughts. It's not a coincidence. It is clear that he saw something I didn't. The word coincidence did not suit a person like Piuwul. The Piuwul he knew was more meticulous and rational than anyone else. It was clear that Piuwul had inferred this place through some calculation that he could not understand. The problem is that Jin Jianwu has no way of finding out by what reason Hukum chose to go here. Piuwul looked at the wall, not paying attention to the old physician's body. There were many empty herb containers hanging on the wall. He got some herbs here. Why was he looking for herbs? Manipulating the human mind is by no means a simple feat, especially if you want to subdue those with great mental strength like martial artists. Going for the usual method is not enough. He already uses cursed poison. Does he really need to use herbs? The more ways he has, the better. Furthermore, I assume that the cursed poison he uses to parasitize the human brain isn't something that can be so easily obtained. If it's so common, there's no reason for him to gather herbs. That must be right. Jin Jianwu shook his head, because Piuwul's reasoning made sense. How scary. How could he think that far with just observing the disappearance of a few herbs? Only after hearing about the reasoning would it make it sound so simple. But even he didn't think that far, only Piuwul managed to immediately grasp the truth. Even if they are looking at the same situation, their point of view and perspective are completely different. So no matter how hard Jin Jianwu tries, he wouldn't be able to have the same foresight as Piuwul. Piuwul is an entirely different person from him. Piuwul carefully inspected the house of the physician. Hukum tried to completely erase his traces in the dark. However, the traces he left behind were clearly visible in Piuwul's eyes. He stayed here for a long time even after killing the physician. He's more daring than I thought. After controlling Xiao Munpyong, Hukum also took advantage of the time where Wen Jiayang was alone and kidnapped her. It was something that ordinary people would not have dared to imagine. In addition to being sneaky, Hukum is quick-witted and decisive in executing his plans. In some ways, he's just like him. Hukum's tenacity of never forgetting once a grudge is formed and the determination to seek revenge is the same as his, as if they were created from the same mold. That's why he felt bad. Piuwul felt bad at the very fact that there is a person who resembles him exists in the world. But at the same time, it was thanks to their similarity that it was easy for Piuwul to understand the actions and behavior of Hukum. Piuwul thought thoroughly from the perspective of Hukum. Now that Hukum has healed his wounds and obtained medicinal herbs here, the next thing he would do must be to look for the perfect opportunity to get his revenge on Jin Jianwu. Piuwul came out. And he found the best place to monitor the 4C pavilion, where Jin Jianwu and his group were staying. Finding the place wasn't too difficult. It was a small house across the 4C pavilion. The family, who appeared to be the owner of the house, had already lost their lives. They now were all stuck in one room, rotting. Do you think Hukum did this? When Jin Jianwu saw the family's body, he was furious, but whether Hukum killed them or not, Pyowul didn't care. He just went to the window and looked at the 4C pavilion. A panoramic view of the 4C pavilion came into view. Pyowul looked at the 4C pavilion for a moment, then looked for any traces left in the room. In fact, there were no traces. All that's left in the room was finely chopped leather pieces, cotton balls, and pieces of steel. Pyowul was quick to realize Hukum's intention. He's thinking of crossing the Western Plateau. What do you mean? Why would he cross the Western Plateau? Pyowul, who had a piece of leather in his hand, said, the leather is oiled. So? Oiling the leather makes it waterproof. And? Those who want to pass through humid places prepare items such as this. He must have used this to make a cloak here. How can you be sure that he would cross the Western Plateau with that alone? The cotton could be used as padding in the leather, which would mean the place he would go is probably going to be cold. For this piece of steel, this can be useful in slippery places. If the piece of steel is put under his shoes, whenever he steps on ice, it would be easier for him to walk. With this, the only area that fits those conditions is the Western Plateau. Although it is connected in Zizing, snow still piled up to the waist of a person at the top of the mountain. Ah! Jin Jianwu exclaimed at Pyowul's explanation. He could not believe that such reasoning would be possible with only a piece of leather, some cotton balls, and pieces of iron. Pyowul laughed. This is because he would have prepared the same even if he was in a position of Hukum. In fact, the coat he was wearing now had a similar effect to the one that Hukum had prepared here. Of course, the cloak Hukum made was incomparably inferior to that of Tang Sochu. Since then, Pyowul has been tracking traces of Hukum without a break. He also found a street where he presumed Hukum had kidnapped one Jie Young. From then on, Hukum's actions became more pronounced. It is by no means easy to kidnap a woman and get out of Chengdu, which is heavily guarded. At the time one Jie Young was kidnapped, the Hao clan members were roaming around the city, so it wouldn't be easy to sneak out of Chengdu while carrying an adult woman. Pyowul inquired if there were any wagons that traveled from last night until dawn. In the end, he discovered that there was a garbage truck that had left Chengdu this morning. A man bought a horse and a carriage from a man who cleaned up the garbage for quite a lot of money. Pyowul asked the owner about the appearance of the horse and carriage in detail. Jin Jianwu's stomach burned in anticipation. Now that they found out that Hukum had escaped by a wagon, Jin Jianwu wanted to hurry and track down Hukum as fast as possible. So he thought that Pyowul was wasting his time asking such useless questions. However, Jin Jianwu still endured his hurried feelings, knowing that there must be a reason for everything Pyowul does. After finishing all the questions, Pyowul finally came out of Chengdu. However, the direction Pyowul was headed was strange. It wasn't the road heading towards the Western Plateau, it was another path leading to a different direction. Jin Jianwu couldn't stand it any longer and asked, "Why are you going here, and not using the shortest route to the Western Plateau?" "No, Maya." "What do you mean?" "A tall horse is an old horse. You can't go that far with a wagon drawn by an old horse who never knows when it will die. I'm sure he must have chosen the waterway. It's easier to hide a woman using that method and he can save a lot of time." "Ah." Jin Jianwu made an awkward expression. He had nothing but admiration. Pyowul was a completely different race from himself. He was good at tracking, and he combined a lot of information that Jin Jianwu inadvertently dismissed to derive the best result. No matter how hard Jin Jianwu tried, he could not have the same perspective as Pyowul. So, he had no choice but to admit that Pyowul was a different kind of person from him. Even this time, Pyowul was right again. This is because horses and wagons that they assumed Hukum must have used were found on a river far away from Chengdu. The overworked old horse was convulsing and breathing heavily. Hukum must have pushed the horse to its limit. Pyowul looked at the river with sharp eyes. And not long after that, the body of a sailor was found. It was clear that Hukum had killed the sailor and extorted his boat. Congratulations. She's still alive. Really? There are remnants of footprints here. Judging by its shape, I assume they belong to a woman. Then based on the shallow depth and erratic direction, it is clear that she cannot move freely. Or, like Pyong whose mind was suppressed. She will be fine. Why do you think so? There's no reason to go this far and kidnap her if he was just going to control her mind. There must be some other reason for him to take her to the Xiaolialian temple while keeping her sane. Who? Jin Jianwu shook his head. He now believes whatever Pyoul says. Finding this place was proof of Pyoul's capability. Jin Jianwu no longer had any doubts about Pyoul's actions. There was always a reason for Pyoul's every action. At first glance, it may seem useless, but once you get to know it, it was a necessary process. Jin Jianwu inadvertently collected too much information, reprocessed it with his own senses and vision, and made a cool decision. And his judgment has never been wrong. That was the reason why Jin Jianwu believed in Pyoul. As time passed, the speed at which Pyoul was tracking Hukum increased. Jin Jianwu didn't bother to ask about Pyoul's movements. He had no reason to ask. All he had to do was believe in Pyoul and follow him. Even in the worst conditions, Pyoul would always find traces of Hukum. As he continued to observe and watch Pyoul, Jin Jianwu thought that Pyoul was terrifying. If anyone would have this man as their enemy, they would no longer have anywhere else to hide in the world. Jin Jianwu is a warrior who prefers head-to-head confrontation, so he was not afraid even if he was against the best swordsman in the world. Since even if he loses, he would be able to convince himself why he was defeated. However, assuming that an assassin like Pyoul was aiming at him, he felt goosebumps all over his body. Since Pyoul is capable of hiding and observing his enemy for days, he will also dig every information about his opponent to find the right moment to attack his opponent's weaknesses. The mere thought of it made Jin Jianwu unable to breathe. Unlike a normal martial artist, there was no such thing as pride for an assassin. An assassin is one who would use any vile means without hesitation. And Pyoul is a pinnacle example of an assassin. Jin Jianwu couldn't even begin to imagine how terrifying the assassination methods of a person like Pyoul has. He was confident that he would never lose against anyone in a face-to-face confrontation, but just thinking that Pyoul would execute a sneak attack, his neck stiffened. Whether he knew what Jin Jianwu was thinking or not, Pyoul is busy concentrating in his pursuit of Hukum. Before he knew it, air was flowing out of Pyoul's mouth. Only after seeing Pyoul's appearance did Jin Jianwu realize that they had already climbed to a high place in the western plateau. The northwestern part of Sichuan was the Qinghai province, while the southwest part of Qinghai province is Zizing. It is the western plateau that drew the boundary line. Theoretically, if anyone would cross the western plateau, they could easily go to Qinghai province of Zizing. However, the process of crossing the western plateau was not so simple. Spring has already arrived in Sichuan, but the snow in the mountains has yet to melt here. The snow was piled high enough to cover the waist. Furthermore, great danger lurked in the area. Among them, the most dangerous ones were the avalanches and the deep cliffs hidden under the snow. If anyone takes a wrong step, they will fall off the cliff of 1,000 meters. Therefore, no matter how familiar a person was with the mountains, they were reluctant to enter the western plateau from autumn to early summer. But for some unknown reason, Pyoul could sense and consequently evaded the danger like a ghost. At first, Jin Jianwu was puzzled why they made a big detour, leaving the straight road. It turns out that the spot in front of them previously was a cliff covered in snow. It was not uncommon for avalanches to occur if they passed through it. Even though Jin Jianwu possessed an undefeated martial arts, he was no different from a small ant in the face of the power of nature. Core. In the face of an avalanche of great majesty that destroyed the ridge, even Jin Jianwu could not close his mouth. If he had been caught in the avalanche, he, too, would have lost his life. Pyoul did not even pay attention to the avalanche. He only focused on chasing after Hukum. Nothing else could distract him. The traces are getting clearer. Until before, traces of Hukum were dim. But from a certain moment, the traces of Hukum were getting stronger. It was because Hukum was being too careful. Since it was Pyowool, he was able to track down the traces of Hukum. But if it were any other person and Hukum had hid his traces so thoroughly, he would not even dream of being pursued. The fact that Hukum no longer cares about leaving traces meant only one thing. He noticed the chase.